Hi, I'm Gretchen Sable. Tonight, we're going to be meeting with Minnesota Secretary of State Steve Simon and Anoka County Elections Manager Paul Linnell to talk about how we're going to run this election for 2020 in the time of COVID. This election cycle, of course, brings lots of people to the polls because it's presidential election, and it also makes it, the COVID issue makes it difficult for all of us, and we have to have lots of special precautions and special concerns. So we're going to learn about that tonight. But first, a little note about League of Women Voters ABC. LWV ABC stands for Anoka, Blaine, Coon Rapids area. We serve all of Anoka County, plus the northern cities of Hennepin County, Champlin, and Dayton. Basically, League of Women Voters is a grassroots organization that encourages informed and active participation in government, and we also work on influencing public policy through education and advocacy. We advocate on issues, but never on individual candidates or political parties. We will be having a number of election forums this year. They'll be aired, a lot of them through QCTV, which we appreciate. You can always also cruise over to our website, lwvabcmn.org. And so we'll let Secretary of State Simon talk first, and Paul Linnell from Anoka County will also join in here. And then we're going to send questions in through the chat function, and I will read those questions. So take it away, Secretary of State Steve Simon.
Well, can you hear me okay?
Yep, we can.
Okay, just holler at me if I'm somehow fading or anything like that. It is possible that a little 6-year-old boy might bolt into the room here, in which case I will make it, I will minimize the awkwardness if that happens, but hopefully you can laugh along. Thank you very much for having me. It's great to be back before this chapter. I remember one of the first League of Women Voters chapters that I addressed in 2015 when I took this office was this one, and I really appreciate it. I think it was in the Andover City Hall? It was in the City Hall building. I don't quite remember, but I think that was right. I think it was Andover. So I always have fond memories of that. It's great to see some familiar faces. Commissioner Meisner, I see Senator and former Commissioner Merriam as well. I'm sure there are others on subsequent pages. I'm just looking at what's in front of me right now. Hello, Paul. I see you as well. Good to see you all. I really appreciate it. So let me just spend the time together, and you've got a lot of others that I'm sure you could appreciate hearing from as well. Telling you that telling you basically what you know, which is this year is going to pose a lot of challenges to those of us who are trying to conduct elections. You know, I like to say, and you've maybe heard me say before, I like to say that I and our office is in the democracy business, and it's a heck of a time to be in the democracy business right now. There is no question about that. There are always a lot of moving parts when you're running any election. That's true always, no matter what the context, big or small. But this year, there are extra and added complications. And I think we have to acknowledge that and talk about kind of a way out. So I would say this, in light of COVID-19, in light of the fact that we are going to be running 2 statewide elections, an August 11th primary and a November election, a November 3rd general election, during the midst of a pandemic, we have to think about this election differently. It's going to look different. It's going to feel different to a lot of folks this year. And that's okay. We've learned to put up with a lot of other things. This pandemic has been disruptive to many people for many reasons. Obviously disruptive when it comes to health and jobs, and our democracy is no different. So I think that we have to think of this, at least in part, as a public health issue. I say that because none of us on this call can reasonably look ahead and predict what the world is going to look like on November 3rd. We could put our heads together on this call and we could probably come up with a fair prediction based on available evidence. And let's say collectively on this call, we all decided, you know what, on November 3rd, it will probably be okay. Things will probably be good. The worst will probably be behind us. That would be one reasonable conclusion that a group like this could come to. But what if we're wrong? What if we guess that way and we're just plain wrong? Then we're in double trouble. We're not just in trouble from the standpoint of democracy. We're in trouble from the standpoint of public health. And I keep coming back to public health because elections are, by their nature, a public event. And let me just lay some math on you to give you a glimpse into our thinking in our office. Now, you didn't think in this meeting tonight there would be any math involved. There is a little math involved, and it's simple math. And here's the math. We have about 3,000 polling places in Minnesota. We're expecting roughly 3 million voters in Minnesota. I'm rounding a little bit, but basically for ease of use, that math is pretty easy. That comes out on average to about 1,000 voters per polling place, on average. Very rough number, very rough average. But if you average it out, it's about 1,000 to 1. And from a public health standpoint, we really need to try to get that number down from 1,000 to 1 to something lower. We don't want 1,000 people and their droplets circulating in what could be relatively closed quarters in a 13-hour period from 7 a.m. to 8 a.m., which is when we vote in Minnesota. If we can avoid it, if we can reasonably avoid it, that is a good thing to do, to try to get those numbers. So that's why we want to get it down from, if not 1,000 to 1, then 800 to 1, or 600, or 500, maybe even lower than that, I don't know. But we think that's a good faith part of the solution here from a public health standpoint. So we know we don't want to be like Wisconsin, for example. You might remember in early April seeing some of the scenes on TV or online or on the news about what happened in Wisconsin. That was an extreme example that I don't think is likely to repeat anywhere. It was extreme because April 7th was relatively early in this crisis. I know that seems like years ago at this point, but transport yourself back in time just a few months to, say, late March or early April, before we knew a lot of the things we knew now. Just as some of the stay-at-home orders and the closures and the shutdowns were happening, there was tremendous anxiety, and there was a lot that was unknown at that time. So Wisconsin, as I'm sure you saw with your own eyes, featured a lot of disruption, I would say even chaos, at many polling places, particularly in certain places. And we want to avoid that kind of thing. Something happened to a lesser extent, but still to a serious extent in Georgia, in the state of Georgia, in its primary, about 5 weeks ago or so now, 5 or 6 weeks ago. Now, the reason that's important isn't just as a model for what we want to avoid, but to put in perspective the fact that they suffered that disruption and they experienced that chaos, and those were primary elections. Just think about that. Those were primary elections. Now imagine a November general election with the presidency of the United States hanging in the balance. Imagine the intensity, the energy, and just the sheer numbers and turnout. So if you think there were problems in Wisconsin and Georgia and other states during their primaries, imagine what could happen in any jurisdiction in America without sufficient planning and a November general election day. So that's what we're trying to avoid, and all our partners in the counties and cities are trying to avoid. As you'll hear, I think, a little bit later tonight, this is a team sport, putting on an election. Our office has a role to play. Anoka County has a role to play. All the counties do, cities, townships, and so forth. And over the next 14 weeks and 1 day, 99 days, we have to have each other's backs. We have to operate as if we are teammates and we are partners, which we are. And so as a result of all of this, I should point out one other thing. You know, if you want to know what the public is thinking about this, Pew Surveys did a national poll fairly recently, and they surveyed the whole country. And 66% of Americans, it turns out, say that they are, quote, uncomfortable. That's the word that they used, uncomfortable going to a polling place during a pandemic. 66%. I don't need to tell all of you, it's hard to get Americans, 66% of Americans, to agree on much of anything these days. That's a really high number for a poll in this era on an issue like that. So I think people are trying to tell us something, and we ought to listen to them when they're trying to tell us that thing, which is please, please plan accordingly and be careful when it comes to an event like an election. So as a result of that, I and my office, and with me today, I should have mentioned earlier, is Michael Wall from our office. He's with our voter outreach team. I'm sure he's waving. I can't see him on my screen, but I saw him at one point. Michael is with our voter outreach team. He specializes in youth voter outreach, although he does a lot more than that. That's one of his specialties. So he can attest to the fact that in our office, really we have two major asks, two major requests of everyone, every individual, every group such as this, between now and November 3rd. So for the next 99 days, one measure of our success is that people will be sick of us, or at least sick of that message, by the time that November 3rd rolls around. Then we'll know we'll have done our job. Here are the two asks from our perspective. Ask number one is for everyone to please consider voting from home this year. Consider it. You don't have to. It's your right to go into a polling place, of course, and we don't want to pretend otherwise, but we ask people to take a good, hard look at voting from home this year. Now, voting from home is nothing new or unique or radical. We have had absentee voting in Minnesota, which is what this is, absentee voting. We have had it for decades and decades. And since 2013, we have had what's called no excuses absentee voting, which means you don't need a reason or you don't need an explanation anymore. You're used to, you don't any longer. So the word absentee is really kind of a relic It refers to a time when you had to be basically absent to vote that way. Now you don't, which is why we're moving away from that term, even though that's in statute, and using phrases like vote from home, because that's a more faithful explanation of what it really is. Every voter, every eligible voter can go to a website, and our website is mnvotes.org. That's mnvotes.org. And when you go to mnvotes.org, you can have that ballot sent to you at home in under 5 minutes. I would say 5 minutes maximum for almost everyone to order that ballot. And you don't have to go online if you don't regularly go online, you don't have that kind of access, whatever it is. You can do it the regular way with paper. You can either download it from our website or by someone else, or you can go into a county office or a city office and you can get the paper forms as well. But doing it is very simple and it's very easy. And normally, as some of you might know from experience, the pitch on voting from home is comfort and convenience. You can vote at home with your feet up. You can vote while you're eating breakfast or folding laundry or watching TV. You can put the ballot down for a day or a week or more, pick it up again, do your own research on the candidates, and so forth. And even before this pandemic, Minnesotans were already flocking to this option. In fact, in 2018, our last major election in 2018, 24% of Minnesotans, almost a quarter, voted absentee in some form, some by mail and some in person at a county courthouse or at a city hall and so forth. But almost a quarter are already, before anyone had even heard of COVID-19, were already taking advantage of this way of voting. That is, voting someday, sometime before election day. So this is not new and we're not starting from zero. So normally, as I say, the pitch for doing this is comfort and convenience. But this year, I would say there's an added reason and a very important reason for doing it, and that is that it's a public service. Because every person who votes from home this year is making the polling place just a little bit safer for the people who choose that option and to go in there on election day, which is their right. And I'm not just referring to the voters when I say that they're protecting or they're making the polling place safer. I'm also referring to the poll workers, to the so-called election judges. We need them. And that leads to my second ask and second request that I and Michael and our whole office has of everyone that will listen to us for the next 99 days. And that is for people to please consider also being an election judge or being a poll worker. I use both terms interchangeably. In statute, it's referred to as an election judge, but there again, our experience is that sometimes that leads to a little bit of confusion. People hear the word judge and they think they're going to have to don a black robe or hold a gavel or something like that, when of course that's not true. So poll worker is a good all-purpose term, but they mean the same thing, election judge or poll worker. And we need 30,000 of them, 30,000 in the state of Minnesota to put on and to administer a statewide election. And that's been a constant figure for quite some time. So 30,000 people need to do that job. And that has almost never been a problem. Even under trying and difficult circumstances, weather, time of year, type of election, our counties and cities and townships have done a really good job of maintaining that roster of people and recruiting and retaining people to do that job. But it's important this year because we've seen what can happen if there's a shortage, particularly a last minute shortage of election judges. I talked a few minutes ago about Wisconsin. Some of what you saw, I would say a large measure of what you saw in Wisconsin, a real, as I say, example of upheaval and even chaos in the polling place, had to do with chronic and last minute understaffing. Election judges or poll workers who elected at the last minute not to serve. So it wasn't that anyone dropped the ball necessarily in Wisconsin. They recruited enough people and those people took the mandatory training. But at the last minute, again, as I was saying a few minutes ago, this is late March, early April, when we knew less, and so much of this was so new for so many of us, a huge number of those who had signed up for that job just declined to serve at the last minute. So the result in Wisconsin was massive and sort of hyper consolidation. Let me give you one other number. In the city of Milwaukee, they had planned for 178 polling places, 178. You know how many they had on primary day on April 7th? 5. They went from 178 to 5. So of course there were long lines. Of course there was upheaval and chaos and bewilderment and people being shut out either literally or figuratively. So that's what you get when you get that kind of chronic understaffing. Now that was an extreme example, like I said, and there are some features of Wisconsin law that we don't have here. I think better features in Minnesota that would avoid a result that's that bad and that is to that extent. But the point is a well-made one, which is overall, you don't want that kind of chronic understaffing. And so it occurs to us that we need to educate a lot of folks or talk up the features of that job. And some of you know this from experience. Can I just see a show of hands? I can only see the first panel here. How many of you have ever been an election judge? Ever? Even one time? Oh, wow. Okay, a lot. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I always say, you know how some people make New Year's resolutions? I have a lifetime resolution, which is any time from now on that I meet an election judge, I always thank them. I don't care whether it was years and years ago or yesterday, because that is a really important job. So thank you and bless you for doing that work. So as many know from experience, it is not a volunteer position. Some people mistakenly believe it is. It's very much a paid position, and it pays sometimes $20 an hour. And some jurisdictions are sweetening the pot this year for all the obvious reasons. So it depends on where you live, because that's a function of local governments, typically cities, sometimes counties. It's a paid position. It requires only 2 hours of training by statute, only 2 hours. There is no geographic restriction on where you can serve if you're above 18 years old. So if you live in Anoka and you want to serve in Eagan, or you want to serve in Mankato or Duluth or Minneapolis or anywhere, you can do that. The one exception is if you're under 18. Now, you can do this job as of age 16. So 16 and 17-year-olds do have a geographic limitation. They have to serve either in their county or, strangely enough, in the statute books, in an adjacent county. So they can serve in their county or one that touches the county that they live in. So, but if you're 18 and above, there is no geographic restriction. Anywhere in Minnesota, if you're willing to travel, doesn't have to be your community. And so I want to get the word out about that. And there are two other things, too, that it seems to us will help in recruiting and retaining election judges. One is to let folks know that we're doing everything we can to get the numbers down. It's that first ask. So they're not going to face 1,000 people during the course of a day on average. They're going to face, we hope, a good number less than that. Why? Because we're really pushing people to strongly consider voting from home. Number two, we spent the time, effort, energy, and money to purchase centrally and distribute to all 3,000 polling places enough supplies and so-called PPE to really make the polling place safe. So we are going to have high-grade, almost surgical-grade masks for all election judges in Minnesota. They're not quite the N95 masks, but they're very, very close. So high-grade masks for all election judges. We will have sort of regular grade and disposable masks for voters who show up without one. We will have hand sanitizer and pumps at all places. We will have wipes. And we also have rules in place, having consulted with the Department of Health and with the CDC. We have rules in place that govern everything from the use of pens to social distancing to the automatic wipe down of the polling surfaces with disinfectant after every use by every voter. So we think we have the bases covered to make it as safe as we can reasonably make it in the polling place. But it's very, very important that we get enough people to do that job. After all, it's no secret. Poll workers and election judges tend to skew older. They tend disproportionately to be seniors or retirees, and they do a phenomenal job, a fantastic job. But we have some evidence that people are taking themselves out of the this year just as a precaution. And so we just need to replenish their ranks, at least temporarily, for the year 2020. Now, having told you what our two asks are, vote from home and be an election judge, I wouldn't blame anyone on this call or on this meeting for listening to that, scratching their heads and saying, wait a minute, isn't there kind of a contradiction there? On the one hand, he's telling me you might want to stay away from the polling place and vote from home. On the other hand, he's actually inviting me to spend the entire day in the polling place. What's going on here? That seems a little contradictory. And I certainly understand that. On the surface, it can appear that way. But the fact is we need two things at once. We need to reduce demand on the polling place as by urging people, if they wish, to consider voting from home. And we need increased supply of poll workers so we avoid, at the extreme, something like Wisconsin and Georgia, but even a fairly minimal disruption that could lead to chaos and people either inadvertently or otherwise being shut out from the right to vote. So those are the two asks. I understand what it might look like on the surface. There's a tension there, no question about it, but both things are needs and both things are true. And so that's where all of you come in. As individuals, as a league chapter, you know, we relied heavily on the League of Women Voters, both statewide and various chapters like yours, to really inform our work, to be honest with us about pushback or feedback that you have, and obviously to do some of the really hard work of democracy. And you all have done that, I know, often and over many years. So at this point, I would love to hear from you, your ideas, your feedback, your pushback, your criticisms, your questions, anything you've got. But you know, we've got 99 days to go. I'm a cautious optimist, by the way. I really am. Minnesotans have been #1 in voter turnout for the last 2 elections in a row. We were #1 in 2018 and #1 in 2016 as well. And there's a reason for that. And well, there are many reasons. One of the reasons is that Minnesotans really like to vote, and Minnesotans will find a way to vote. And I think that's going to happen again this year. So with that, I'm happy to hand it over. And by the way, Michael is with me in part because he's an expert. He's been with us for a couple election cycles now, and he can answer some of your questions too, and maybe suggest some strategies as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Paul, would you like to go first, and then we'll do questions for both of you, because it seems like the questions are kind of dual, if that's okay with the secretary? Paul?
Yeah, that works fine from my side as well. And I'll try and be brief and leave more time for questions. I think it's good to be able to get those answered. And I think the secretary did an excellent job of illuminating a number of the same points that I would make. And I think that's reflected in the fact that it has this entire year, and as is the case every year in Minnesota, been a real partnership between the secretary's office down to the counties, down to the municipalities, that all work closely to make sure that we can put on the election without a hitch, or with as few hitches as possible. And certainly this year has tested all of our best made plans. I know, we talk a lot about how going into 2020, we thought the presidential nomination primary in March would be the biggest thing, the biggest new hurdle we'd have to deal with. And that seems like ages ago, dealing with that challenge relative to what we're experiencing now. But on the two, kind of commenting a bit on the 2 asks that the secretary laid out with considering voting by mail and looking at staffing our polling places with election judges. In Anoka County, so for the primary election on August 11th, we, as of today, have now mailed out more than 25,000 absentee ballots. Just to give you a sense of scale of where that sits in past elections, the high watermark of ballots that we've sent out as a county for an entire absentee period was a little over 14,000 for the 2018 general election. So we've now sent out more than 11,000 additional ballots, and we still have 2 weeks to go until election day. So that is for just the primary. Gives you a sense of what we're probably looking at when it comes to the general election. From the county side, we have made tremendous efforts to staff our office, to give our team here the resources that we need to keep up with that demand. Typically, we have 2 or 3 temporary staff. We're currently up to 16 with another round that's coming in shortly to make sure that we are ready and can handle the onslaught of applications, turning out the ballots, getting them turned around to voters as quickly as possible, and then processing them when they come back to our office. So we can certainly talk more about this when it comes to questions and responding to concerns around security of the ballot when it comes to absentee voting. We hand inspect with a team of 2 every single ballot that comes back to our office to make sure that it matches key data points like a last 4 of the social or a driver's license number that was included on the voter's application. So there is a 1-to-1 tie out. A voter has more live ballots than their application, so it's not possible for someone to submit multiple ballots. So we have these security checks in place that have always been in place. And I think, yes, I do agree with the secretary that it's certainly going to look different in a number of ways for this year's election, but there's a lot that remains the same, and that we've had no excuse absentee in place. So from the election administrators' perspectives, we're able to go off of a foundation of something that we're familiar with, and certainly scale is going to be much different. But we feel that we're well prepared in Anoka County to scale up and to continue to administer the process effectively as we have in past years. When it comes to election judges, we've reached out to our cities throughout this process and have continued to make additional efforts to encourage folks to sign up, and have seen great strides through our county newsletter, through a postcard that was sent out to all residents across the county, has resulted in a number of additional election judges signing up to serve on election day. But we think the need is going to be ongoing. For some folks, the governor's executive order maybe changed their their thinking as far as requirements there. It may bring new people into the fold. Others may not, be able to don a mask for an entire day. So, as the public health situation evolves, we know that may change the status of already confirmed election judges. So from now through August, September, October, our cities will continue to take applications. You can apply at anokacounty.us/elections and fill out an interest form. We'll send that on to the cities and make sure that they get in touch with you to send an application. So we encourage you to spread the word if it's not something that you're in a position to do from your own risk profile. Pass it along to others in your network that you think may be interested. And I think we're sending that far and wide. So I know the message is being well received. And one more thing, but so I don't forget, I want to make sure I give a shout out to the League of Women Voters, ABC, for all of your help with cutting and pulling off our I voted stickers. So our intention is that every absentee voter will still get an I voted sticker, and you gals have done a wonderful job of getting those ready, and our team is actually starting to build the absentee packs already for the general election. So those will be included there. So many thanks for your help with that, and look forward to any questions that you may have.
Okay, I will just add on to what Paul just said. We still have 7 bags of stickers on rolls that need to be separated. So if anybody wants to try their hand at separating stickers, we can set you up. You get a bag of 20 rolls, and then they turn into however many thousand stickers that is. So it's a fun little enterprise. So we'll just dig in on questions here. And I'm going to start at the last questions and work up because that seems easier. So if you're looking at allowing people to vote in person in counties where they work but don't live, no. Someone wants to know if you are looking at allowing people to vote where they work but don't live. For like a lot of people that live in Blaine, work in Hennepin and Ramsey counties. It would be nice for you to show up there and just have them print out a ballot for you.
Well, that's not something that Minnesota law allows at this point. As Paul knows, there are 1 or 2 states, Colorado among them, that have experimented with so-called vote centers, where you can have ballots on demand and that sort of thing. And that might be in our future at one point. It will not be in place for this election in 2020, though. That's for sure.
And just to speak specifically to in-person absentee voting, if people have questions about where they can go to do that, that might be at, just specifics in Anoka County. Every municipality has a designated location where voters can go starting 46 days prior to Election Day, as well as the county government center to vote early. On Election Day, it'll always be your polling place, so you can find that on the Secretary's site. If it has changed for this year, you will receive a postcard notifying you of that change.
Thanks. When's the last reasonable date to request a ballot and still have time to mail it back for the primary this time?
So our office will continue to process those, really right up until the weekend right prior to Election Day. Reasonable, I think, is a good way of asking. If you're applying online, that turnaround time is a lot faster. We get those, typically the next day after they're verified. If a voter has to call our office to request a paper application, there's additional back and forth there. But from the time we get the application and send out the ballot, I think the USPS says about 2 weeks prior to Election Day, so that it's a week to get the ballot to you and then a week for the ballot to come back. We may be able to process that in a shorter amount of time, but we say the earlier you apply, the better.
And the ballots that come in by the end of voting, or that count? Is that correct? Who counts? Does it have to be postmarked by the end of voting or at your office at the end of voting?
And yeah, it's a good question. So for the primary election, and this was the Secretary can speak to the consent decree that was reached, but there's an extra 2 days in Anoka County for voters to have their ballots arrive at our office. They do still need to be postmarked on or before Election Day, but we will now accept ballots for the primary election alone on the Wednesday or Thursday following Election Day. As it stands now for the general election, it is still an Election Day deadline that the ballot needs to be in our office.
Well put, and let me just, and thank you for that, Paul. And by the way, you should all know this. Paul and his team, they're really such pros. You're very fortunate. So let me just comment a little bit on that. Paul is right. Everything he said was right. There's some litigation right now, and I can only say a little bit about that, except to say that it is possible that there will be changes for the general election of that kind. So as he just said, for the primary election only, the rule is a postmark rule, not an arrive-by rule. It's got to be postmarked by election day, but must arrive no later than 2 days after the election, 48 hours afterwards. There is litigation ongoing on that very question for the general election. As Paul correctly said, right now, knowing nothing else, the rule is going to be an arrive-by rule for the general election, but that could change. In fact, there's a hearing before the judge this Friday, which could decide much or all of those questions. So stay tuned. But for right now, it's just the primary that's departing from that normal rule.
Okay, here's a question for Paul. You sent out 25,000 ballots. Have they started coming back yet?
Yes, I don't have the exact number. I think we're somewhere between 8,000 and 9,000 that have already have arrived and have been accepted in our office. Due to a legislative change this year, we now have an extra 7 days to start opening those envelopes and start getting them ready for counting. So that'll actually start this Wednesday, and we've got a number of election judges that will be coming into the county government center to start opening those envelopes, and that was a welcome change. I know the secretary worked closely with both parties in the legislature to get that passed, so that from an administrative perspective is incredibly helpful to give us an extra 7 days to get those processed. Some states I know wait until election day, and we'll be dealing with some significant challenges for working through that.
And if I may add a little something to that, Paul, because counties will begin or can 2 weeks ahead to open those envelopes, that means if for some reason you want to change your vote, if you've already submitted your absentee ballot, you only have until that 2 week before mark rather than the 1 week before to get your ballot spoiled, and then depending on the time, either get another one sent, pick one up, or go to your polling place. So it changes that as well.
Here's a kind of related question. A recent election had candidates that dropped out after absentee ballots were submitted, so many people lost their vote. Has anything changed in how that would work out?
Yeah, I think Michael nailed it there. That's the so-called clawback period. And that always starts the day on which elections administrators like Paul and his team can open those ballots. So you send ballots in, basically they sit in a pile, in essence, just picture it that way anyway. They sit in a pile until day -7 in most years, but this year day -14. And then on day -14, they can start being opened and processed. That also is the day, because that's the day they are open and processed, that is the last time to change your vote. So the bottom line is this year in both the primary and the general election, if someone drops out or for whatever other reason you want to change your mind and vote for candidate B instead of candidate A in a particular contest, you have until 14 days before the election to claw back, as it's called, your ballot and change your vote.
We'll call it organized storage in our secure ballot room.
Yes, right. That's much better than sitting in a pile. Yeah.
Okay, here's a question. What happens if a voter refuses to wear a mask?
Well, so as Paul knows, we've talked a lot with inside and outside counsel about that. As you know, there's a mandatory mask rule in place right now. But because voting is a constitutional right, to be honest, I mean, the bottom line is we can't condition the right to vote on wearing a mask. What we have, the guidance that we provided to counties and cities is that every voter who comes in without a mask should be offered a mask and should be asked to wear a mask. And where possible, where feasible, an election judge, if someone still refuses a mask, then the voter could be offered another place to vote, maybe an adjacent corridor, or maybe even using curbside voting and voting at their vehicle. If despite those invitations, a voter still insists that, no, I don't want to go in the hallway, I don't want to go to my vehicle, I came here to vote, I'm going to vote, and you can't make me wear a mask. The bottom line is you can't deny them a ballot. And so that's really the bottom line, even in light of the mask mandate. Now, they might be, it's certainly up to Paul and his colleagues. Typically what happens is there's something called an incident log, which is basically that. It's just marking any incident. If a voter does something that is unlawful, that's at least marked, and then it's up to folks at the county to decide after the election what to do with that. So the person could still be on the hook for the $100 fine for violating the mask mandate if it gets to that point. but you can't deny them a ballot because they refuse to wear a mask. That's the bottom line.
And I know part of the emphasis on the county side, as Secretary Simon laid out the steps to provide a voter a mask, give that curbside option, is around, not escalating tensions. And I'm sure you've seen videos of some of the cases where things have gotten to a point where no one wants to see, especially at a polling place. So, yes, we'll take down that information and would pass along to local law enforcement if need be after the election. But the idea would be to de-escalate and provide some guidance for election judges on how to handle that type of situation.
Yes, well said.
We have a question that came. Secretary of State Simon talked a little bit about the steps that are being taken to make election judges as safe as possible. Do you want to reiterate that just one more time? And I had a question about, does that include plexiglass screens, or are we just doing it kind of as we?
Yeah, so I guess the things that I'd mentioned, and there are several things, is, if I'm talking to someone who's on the fence about doing this or not, two of the things that I would highlight are, number one, we're doing everything we can to get the numbers of people in polling places down. Now, right to vote in whatever fashion that they want, but we are strongly urging people to take a look at voting from home. And so far, they are definitely obliging. They're definitely doing that. We are way, way, way up, as you heard Scott say. And that's the same statewide as well. I mean, by huge multiples of what we have been in the last two elections. And number two, we are providing supplies or PPE for every one of Minnesota's 3,000 polling places, including high-grade, almost surgical grade masks for election judges themselves, regular grade masks that are more disposable for voters who show up without one and put one on, hand sanitizers, pumps, wipes, and then a list of rules or protocols around everything from social distancing to the wipe down of polling surfaces and so forth. So those are the things that we're really emphasizing. In terms of other items, I'm glad that the questioner mentioned that. So Congress and the president made available to the states some money exactly for this purpose, for COVID-19 pandemic related elections. And so the way that we've worked it out in terms of the formula is we are providing what I just mentioned, but we're also providing money to counties and cities so that if they wish, they don't have to, but if they wish, they can supplement those things. And the plastic shields are a really good example. We looked into that. We contacted a vendor or plastic shields, sneeze guards, that sort of thing. And it soon became pretty clear to us that ordering that centrally for 3,000 polling places really worked, because that's very polling place dependent, right? It depends on the dimensions. Is it a church basement? Is it a basketball court? Is it, where is it? And so it was a little awkward and not very practical to order that centrally. But if Scott or if a community in Anoka County or wanted to use some of the money they're going to be getting for elections administration in a pandemic, if they wanted to, and many are at this point, to use it to supplement other supplies, they can do that as well.
Yeah, and I can say quickly for Anoka County that yes, it seems like a majority of our municipalities are putting in place some of those plexiglass shields for some of their judge positions, providing additional sanitizer. Some are getting gloves and other face shields. So it may be polling place dependent, but those additional items are likely to be seen in most of the polling places.
Good. Here's one for Steve. When does the state have to certify which presidential candidate won the state so that the 10 electors know that they're required to be in St. Paul to officially cast the vote?
Yes. So that's very interesting. That leads me to another sort of plug. And we're telling news media, we're telling voters, election night is going to look and feel a little bit different. Now, you're a part of this organization on this call because you love elections and you love democracy. And like me, election night is fun. Election night is the Super Bowl and the World Series combined. It's interesting. It gives you energy. That's how I feel about it, at least. And we're used to a certain instant gratification in Minnesota because we pretty much know the result and all or nearly all of the results that night. But certainly in the primary, and the general, because of action in the regular legislative session, there will be some more time after Election Day this year, one time only, to count ballots, particularly absentee ballots. And so we're not going to know everything on election night. Now, on election night, Paul and his colleagues around the state will be able to report what they have. They'll be able to report all their in-person totals, and they'll be able to report that night all of the absentee ballots that they have on hand and have been able to tally. But of course, in subsequent days, it could be 2 days, it could be more than that, depending on the outcome of this litigation, but certainly for 2 days, in the primary and in the general election, there will be other absentees rolling in. And so we might not have final and complete and total results until at least a couple days later. But what we will know on election night is the number of outstanding absentee ballots. So you won't be left wondering, gee, I wonder how many could come in. You'll know what the ceiling is. You'll know, and Paul and others will be able to report, okay, this is how many absentee ballots are outstanding. It's not going to be any higher than this. It might be lower than that because not everyone sends it in or submits it, but you'll know what the ceiling is. And so you'll be able to calculate within reason based on the gaps in candidates, whether you have a for sure winner or not. As for the President of the United States, I know that come up for a lot of reasons. You have to sort of work backwards by some dates that are absolutely fixed in law. And one of the dates that is fixed in law is the date that the Electoral College is convened. I think you're that December 14th. So we know that it has to be decided and there has to be a statewide final canvass and result and certification before December 14th. No ifs, ands, or buts. And if you remember back to 2000 and Bush versus Gore, one of the reasons that was so quick and so hurry up and so speedy, whether that was for good or not, was those fixed dates. They really can't be moved. No one has tested that before. And so that sort of dictated everything. And the same is here. So I would say the ultimate drop dead date is whatever date it would take to have a final result certified so that the Electoral College can convene nationwide and in Minnesota on December 14th. That's the best answer I can give you. That might mean different things at different times, but the absolute limit would be that.
Okay, we have a member who's doing our Instagram work, and she says that she's doing get out the vote work on Instagram. Some people are concerned about voter fraud. Measure to ensure that each voter only votes once and that a ballot is tracked. What's the process of voting?
Yeah, I'm happy to address that. I'd be interested in Paul's thoughts too. And we get that question. And I will tell you, particularly because so many people are voting from home, here's how the question comes out specifically. I don't mean to hijack your question, but let me give you a particular way that I sometimes get that question. The question usually goes something like this. By the way, I don't blame anyone for asking this question. This isn't a conspiracy theory. It's a very, very honest question. Someone will say something like this. They'll say, hey, look, you're going to have a lot of people voting by mail this year or voting from home and using the mails to both receive the ballot and send the ballot out. I'm very nervous, the questioner might say, about all these blank ballots floating around. On postal pallets and post offices and stuffed into people's unguarded mailboxes. And what's to prevent some clever would-be thief from hanging around the mailboxes? Let's say the city of Andover mails all of its ballots on a Wednesday. What's to prevent a would-be thief from hanging around the mailboxes on Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, hoping to swipe 2 or 10 or 20 or 100 ballots for himself? Or what's to prevent someone from creating a diversion at a post office and making off with 100 that he can vote for himself? It's a good question. It's a fair question. I want to treat it seriously. The answer to that in Minnesota, I can't speak knowledgeably about any other state, but in Minnesota, the answer to that is that when you go to mnvotes.org or you otherwise order that ballot to come to you at home, you have to provide some personal identifying information. It's typically the last 4 of your social security number, could be your driver's license number, could be a state ID number, could be other things if you have none of those things. But the point is you have to provide some personal identifying information to even get that absentee ballot. So unless the would-be thief at the post office or at the mailbox not only knew your personal identifying information, but knew which particular form of it you as the intended voter used when you ordered that ballot, that person could steal 100 or 200 or 1,000 ballots and vote them all and mail them all in. And guess what? They're never going to be counted, ever. So Paul and his shop or others in cities or townships across Minnesota, they're going to see that, and that information is going to be absent, and those ballots will never be counted. So the joke, in a sense, is on the would-be thief. And that is really the gold standard in terms of the security there. And I don't know what else you want to say about that, Paul, but that's what I think should give everyone on this call and everywhere confidence that you're not going to have the mailbox thief or the postal thief getting away stealing a bunch of ballots for himself. And I would just ask this, I have asked our elections director, and I asked several folks at the county level who have been at this for a lot longer than I have, for decades. I said, hey, do you know of a case of that happening in Minnesota, just in recent history in the last 20, 30 years, of someone either at a post office or at mailboxes swiping a bunch of blank ballots for themselves and somehow knowing the personal identifying information that the particular intended voter used and successfully casting 2 or 10 or 20 or 100 ballots? Do you know of it happening? And their response to me was, no, they don't. Now, that doesn't mean it hasn't happened. It means it has escaped their notice and they don't know of it. So I just want people to feel secure. It's not wrong to ask the question. It's a good question. It's a fair one. But we have precautions and security measures in place to make sure that that is almost impossible to happen.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add is just to kind of add on to that is to say the same checks that are in place to verify that, you know, a voter is only going to have one ballot that comes back to us, you know, and we're verifying against the identifying numbers that are returned, whether it's the last 4 or the driver's license, but is also to allow us the opportunity to send out replacement ballots and to issue, you know, a ballot to a voter that may never have gotten their ballot in the first place. And it's happened before, I think more frequently with voters that are out of state, but if they've entered an incomplete address on their application and it never gets delivered to them, most of those will come back to us because election mail is non-forwardable. So it'll come back and we can do some investigating to see why that might have been returned. But it gives that voter an opportunity to still, you know, have a replacement ballot sent to them. So we can contact them, let them know, you know, it came back to us and we'll send them out a replacement. Same thing if a voter makes a mistake marking their ballot or they, you know, sealed up their envelopes without putting their ballot inside, we can send out additional materials, generate a new unique ballot ID, and know that it's just going to be that one ballot that comes back and would ultimately be accepted. The other piece, I guess I would just say is on, you know, I think I mentioned this briefly, but at the polls on election day in Anoka County, we have electronic poll books. We send out updates to those rosters prior to election day and then throughout the day on election day as we're accepting additional absentee ballots. So those rosters are constantly updated to reflect voters that have an accepted absentee ballot. So that person can't just show up at the polling place and say, I want to vote in both places. That roster will indicate that they've already had a ballot cast.
I'm going to jump in for 1 second, Paul, because you mentioned a term that I think people need to be familiar with. You talked about a unique ID number for that ballot. So I happen to have my wife's signature envelope, which is not going to show up here, but there is a barcode. Her ballot, I've already sent mine in, has its own number connecting that signature envelope with her. So in addition to the requirement that she use an identifying number, an official number on her application and then match it on her signature envelope, it also has a barcode so that I couldn't use her ballot and neither could anyone else. They'd have to tear that off and have no ballot ID, which, as Paul told you, is a part of the process. So I think that's another level that people can feel good about.
Yeah, Wes noticed here that we're running low on time, but we have a bunch of questions. So if you guys are okay with going for a few more minutes, is that okay? We have several questions and discussions about curbside voting. Will there an increase in curbside voting, and how much does that add to the burden of running an election? You know, we've always had curbside voting. When I do election judging, I've done it, you know, probably half the elections. We have somebody you need to go outside and help them vote. So it's nothing new, but do you expect a whole lot more this year?
Yeah, if I can answer first for Anoka County and our side. And like you mentioned, Gretchen, I think it is important to note that curbside voting has been available, and it's maybe a term that's new to a lot of folks, and certainly people are seeing it from some of the other primaries that have taken place and people voting from their vehicles. We've always, you know, election judges are trained to administer curbside voting and will have all the tools and things they need to be able to administer this process. You know, there may be some additional, I think, steps that are going to be taken, and it's something that I think we expect to you know, learn from the primary a little bit to see if the numbers of election judges that we have in place will be sufficient, or if we anticipate that more will be needed because it's a more labor-intensive process, and that it requires 2 judges of different political parties to administer curbside voting. So if we are seeing that in significantly higher numbers, that may need to change how we accommodate that. But from a perspective of the protective equipment, obviously the judges will have their masks, and will still be expected that if voters have a mask, that they will have that on. Using sanitizing disinfectant on materials that are used between voters, obviously washing hands or using gloves to make sure that things are clean between voters as that process is being administered.
We have a question about, you think the post office is going to be able to handle all this volume of ballots coming through at once?
Well, I'd be interested in Paul's take on that. I will say that I've been on 2 calls now, group calls with other secretaries of state that have included the Deputy Postmaster General of the United States. And I remember on the first call, someone asked the question, just the volume question, not so much speed, but volume. And he sort of chuckled into the phone and he said, believe me, nothing compares to Christmas. He said, even if everyone in America voted, by mail, he said, we think we could handle it because we're equipped to handle the holidays. That said, there is, at least from our perspective, and I want to hear what Paul says too, but from our perspective, there is the issue of speed. They have the employees, they have the people to do it, or so they assure us, and I believe them. But the question is speed. And so we're advising people, for example, in the primary, as you heard Paul say earlier, the rule because of this litigation this year is postmarked by August 11th, but it's got to arrive by the 13th. I'm not so sure I would postmark it by the 11th if I were you or anyone, because you're really banking on it getting to where you want to go in 2 days. And it depends on your tolerance for risk. Mine is that I wouldn't do that. I would send it before Election Day just to make sure. How far before Election Day? It's really tough to say. It depends on where you live. But keep in mind, in many places in Minnesota, not necessarily in Anoka County, but in many places in Minnesota, even sending mail to your next door neighbor could take 3 or 4 or 5 days. That's because there have been closures in recent years of a lot of mail sorting facilities in Minnesota. So if you're in Bemidji, this is a real example. If you're in Bemidji, Minnesota, you want to send a letter literally to your next door neighbor, it's going to take you 3, 4, or 5 days. Why? Because the mail will go down to the Twin Cities to be sorted and go back up again to Bemidji so it can be sent to your next door neighbor. Now that's not Anoka County so much, but I urge people to be cautious, especially in the primary. Postmark +2 doesn't mean you should wait until the last minute and postmark. Paul, I'm interested in what you've heard as well.
Yeah, no, I think the same sort of things from USPS, and certainly in talking with our local post office here in Anoka for the ballots that we send out and get back. I think they've been incredibly responsive and helpful in getting us supplies and things that we need, as well as ensuring as we get closer to Election Day that we can have ballots brought to our office in a timely fashion, or have teams go over there to bring ballots over earlier. What I might comment on is just on the processing side, before we can even get it into the hands of USPS, is what needs to take place from an application that needs to be, if it's a paper application, hand keyed into SVRS, or if it's an online application processed. Labels are then generated, and then there's a process of ensuring the correct ballot goes into the envelopes and is sent out to the voter. So that process takes time, and as I talked about us staffing up and having the resources to deal with that, we're going to continue to hammer applying earlier in the process. I think having as many people apply for the primary and indicate they would like a ballot for both elections is going to be a great head start. I think Minnesota has the longest absentee period, I believe, in the country. So given that we'll start mailing ballots out beginning 46 days prior, the week leading up to September 18th, should be plenty of time. And we'll continue to process those as we go. But I think the message will be apply as soon as possible. We will do everything in our power to keep up and get ballots turned around within a few days. But the hope is that the surge comes before that start of absentee voting, so that we can really ramp up and be have the necessary resources to keep up with that.
And if I could just put a fine point on that, that was very well said. Our office plans in August to play a role in that. Details to come, but basically, you talk a lot in COVID-19 of flattening the curve. That's the curve we want to help Paul and his colleagues to flatten. We talked about Wisconsin a lot tonight. One of the problems in Wisconsin you heard was a last minute collapse of the election judge system. Another problem in Wisconsin that contributed to some of the chaos was a last minute surge absentee ballot applications, not the actual sending of absentee ballots. I'm talking about people who decided very late in the game, a few days before the election, that, hey, maybe I should vote from home this year, and then deluged county and city elections administrators with these applications, just the applications, let alone the ballots. And so what we're telling folks this year is to flatten that curve is, hey, please, if you think there's even a possibility that you'll want to vote from home, please apply in July. Please apply in August. Please maybe apply in September. Okay, first half of September. But please don't wait until the very end. For Paul's sake, for his colleagues' sake, for our office's sake, it's just going to be a pretty picture if people decide at the very end to do it. And for those who are on the fence about this and they really don't know, the one point I don't think I've emphasized is the decision to apply for an absentee ballot is reversible. It is reversible. So if you decide that you want to vote from home and then you have a change of heart, you or anyone you go and talk to after tonight, they can do that. You can say, you know what, thank you. I applied for the absentee ballot. Thank you for sending it to me. But I don't need it anymore. Things look safe. And I'm going to stroll in and vote on game day, vote on election day in the polling place. That's okay. You weren't held to that choice. That ballot will be destroyed. It won't be counted. Now, don't do both, of course. That's a felony. So don't vote twice in both ways. But it is reversible. This is not some decision you're making for anyone that you can never go back on. You can go back on it. You can reverse it. So all the incentive in the world to order that ballot and have the folks that you talk to after tonight order that ballot to come to them at home today. Do it now. Do it this summer before we get into the late fall.
So there's a number of questions about requesting your ballot, because you have to put down what your last four of your social or your driver's license number. And then it has to match. You have to put that same number on when you send it back. Everything's forgotten in intervening time, which you did.
And we've been getting a handful of those phone calls over the last few weeks as people may not remember what they put on there. Most people tend to put both, in which case if you provide either on your signature envelope, it's going to be fine and we'll be able to accept it. You can also call our office. We can verify, look up at your application which one you may have put down, and then the other option would be to just put both on the signature envelope. If you put both, that's fine. We will then know that if you have either one of them in your application and it matches, that we'll be able to accept it. There is a small, if you did apply using a paper application and you didn't include your number or there's not a match, we can do a signature match to what was provided on your paper application. But with the majority applying online, if we don't have that signature match, then we're not able to push that through.
I think the last question we'll do is about early voting and why we don't do it like it's regular voting. So when you go to vote at the county office, do you still have to fill out a form for absentee?
Yes, you do. And maybe the secretary can speak to this question as well, but it's really what's provided to us in state law, and the words early voting, I don't believe appear anywhere in Minnesota election law. It's all from the absentee voting process and the evolution into no excuse absentee voting and no excuse in-person absentee voting. So yes, the process mirrors exactly what you would get by mail up until 7 days prior to election day. And there was a change in 2016 that allows for a slightly modified process where an application is still required, but a voter is able to take their ballot and insert it directly into a ballot counter during those last 7 days instead of having to put it into the series of envelopes. So it's a little closer to early voting, but it's still not quite the same as what you'd have on election day.
Okay, well, thanks. Thank you again to Secretary of State Steve Simon and Anoka County Election Manager Paul Linnell.